In the stillness of ancient Jerusalem, when shadows crept along the city walls and kings trembled at the march of empires, a solitary voice rose above the clamor of markets and the whispers of priests. It was not the voice of a warrior brandishing a sword, nor the decree of a monarch sitting on a golden throne, but the voice of a prophet who claimed to speak the words of the Almighty Himself. His name was Isaiah, and the power of his speech cut deeper than any blade. His words challenged kings, unsettled priests, comforted the brokenhearted, and foretold a hope that would echo for centuries beyond his death. Imagine a man standing in the temple, the smoke of sacrifices rising into the air, when suddenly the heavens themselves were torn open and he beheld a vision of the Lord enthroned in unimaginable glory. That vision would mark him forever, shaping the destiny of his people and laying down prophecies that even millennia later would stir debates, inspire faith, and haunt the conscience of nations. Isaiah did not merely warn of disaster, he painted pictures of redemption, of a future where justice would roll down like waters and the wolf would dwell with the lamb. But he also carried the unbearable burden of truth, rejected by some, revered by others, condemned to proclaim what no one wished to hear, that judgment was coming, that the proud would be humbled, and that only by returning to the Holy One of Israel could salvation be found. This is the story of Isaiah, not just a prophet, but a poet of fire and hope, whose words have carved their way into the bedrock of human history. Isaiah's world was not a peaceful one. The great powers of the Near East loomed like storm clouds. Assyria with its iron armies, Babylon waiting in the wings, Egypt offering false promises of alliances. The tiny kingdom of Judah sat like a lamb between wolves, torn between trust in God and the temptation to rely on human power. Kings like Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah each faced the pressure of politics, war, and idolatry. Into this swirl of fear and ambition, Isaiah stepped, declaring with unshakable conviction that history itself was in the hands of the Lord. He told Judah that foreign treaties would fail, that idols carved of wood and stone were worthless, that only the living God could save. He warned that the people's arrogance, greed, and injustice would bring ruin upon the nation. And yet, woven into his fierce warnings were visions of unimaginable hope: a child to be born, a servant to suffer, a redeemer to bring light to all nations. His scroll became both a mirror reflecting Judah's corruption and a window opening onto a future of peace and restoration. From the very beginning, Isaiah's calling was marked by awe and terror. In the year that King Uzziah died, he entered the temple and saw the Lord high and lifted up, his robe filling the temple, while seraphim cried out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Isaiah fell to the ground, overwhelmed by his own unworthiness, until a burning coal touched his lips and purified him for the task ahead. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" The voice of the Lord thundered, and Isaiah replied with trembling courage, "Here am I, send me." From that moment forward, his life was no longer his own. He became the mouthpiece of God, carrying messages of both doom and deliverance to a people who often preferred silence. His words were poetry, but not mere ornament. They were fire, consuming illusions, igniting hope, forcing the hearer to decide whether to trust or to turn away. As Isaiah's ministry unfolded, the streets of Jerusalem became his stage. He thundered against the wealthy who trampled the poor, against rulers who twisted justice, against priests who performed rituals without sincerity. He declared that sacrifices without obedience were worthless, that the cries of widows and orphans rose louder than the songs of worship. He challenged King Ahaz to trust in God alone when armies gathered at Judah's gates, offering the sign of a child called Emmanuel. He counseled Hezekiah to resist the arrogance of Assyria's king, assuring him that the Lord would defend the city. And when Babylon eventually rose to power, Isaiah foresaw not only Judah's exile, but also a return, a rebuilding, and a future glory greater than the past. But Isaiah's voice carried beyond politics and war. He envisioned a day when swords would be beaten into plowshares, when nations would no longer learn war, when the desert would bloom like a rose, when the blind would see and the lame would leap for joy. His words reached beyond the horizon of his own century, pointing to a servant who would bear the sins of many, despised and rejected, yet exalted in the end. These prophecies, later cherished by Christians as foreshadowing Jesus Christ, gave Isaiah a place not only in Jewish tradition but in the heart of Christianity. Yet even for those who do not share that faith, Isaiah's vision of justice, peace, and divine holiness remains one of the most profound contributions to the moral imagination of humanity. And so begins our journey into the life and message of Isaiah, a man of visions, a prophet of fire, a poet of hope, whose voice still resounds across the ages. His story cannot be told in fragments. It must flow as one great river, winding through judgment and mercy, despair and promise, until it empties into the ocean of human destiny. Let us follow that river, listening to the words that once shook Jerusalem, words that even now refuse to be silenced. Isaiah walked through the streets of Jerusalem as a man burdened with visions that would not let him rest. Every stone of the city, every cry in the marketplace, every whisper in the royal court seemed to echo with the weight of what he had seen in the temple that day. The holiness of God had seared itself into his soul, and once a man has seen such glory, nothing else appears the same. The gold of the palace was dim compared to the train of the Lord's robe. The chants of priests sounded hollow compared to the thunder of the seraphim. He was no longer a mere citizen of Judah, nor even a respected figure in society. He was a messenger carrying fire on his lips, and fire does not rest until it consumes what it touches. Isaiah's voice, when it rose in the public square, cut through the noise like a trumpet blast. He spoke of corruption in the courts, of leaders who pursued wealth while neglecting the poor, of merchants who cheated with dishonest scales, of women who flaunted luxury while widows starved. He warned that all the rituals in the temple, all the sacrifices of lambs and bulls were worthless without hearts turned toward righteousness. His words unsettled many, for they revealed uncomfortable truths. Yet there was something irresistible about him, as though an unseen power compelled both king and beggar alike to listen. During the reign of King Ahaz, the crisis of faith reached a breaking point. Two neighboring kingdoms, Aram and Israel, conspired to attack Judah, threatening to depose the Davidic king and install their own puppet. Fear gripped the city. Soldiers sharpened their spears, mothers hushed their children at night as rumors of invasion spread, and the palace echoed with frantic debate over whether to turn to Assyria for help. Into this moment, Isaiah came not with military strategy, but with a message that defied reason. Do not fear these smoldering stubs of firewood. The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The words fell like lightning. A child as a sign of deliverance, a promise of God's presence embodied in human life. To the fearful, it seemed impossible, almost foolish, and King Ahaz refused to believe. He chose alliance with Assyria instead, sealing Judah's fate with chains of dependence. Isaiah walked away from the palace heavy-hearted, for he knew that trust in human powers would only hasten disaster. Yet his words remained, preserved in the scroll, waiting to echo in generations yet unborn. Isaiah was not only a prophet of speech. At times he became a living symbol of his message. When words were not enough, he acted out parables that shocked and unsettled. Once, he walked barefoot and stripped of his prophet's robe for 3 years, a sign to Judah that Egypt and Cush nations they trusted for help would themselves be led away captive in shame. Another time, he named his children with prophetic names, each embodying a message. Shear, Jashub, meaning a remnant shall return, and Maher, Shalal Hashbaz, meaning swift is the spoil, speedy is the prey. Each child's name was a sermon, a reminder to the people that God's judgment and mercy were not distant abstractions, but realities pressing upon their daily lives. Those who saw Isaiah may have mocked him, yet his very presence became a reminder that the word of the Lord was alive, embodied, unavoidable. During the terrifying days when Assyria marched across the land like an unstoppable storm, Isaiah's counsel was sought by King Hezekiah. The Assyrian king Sennacherib sent envoys to mock Judah, boasting that no god of any nation had delivered them from his hand, and Judah's God would be no different. The people trembled, the city quaked, but Isaiah stood firm. He declared that Sennacherib's arrogance would be his downfall, that the Lord would defend Jerusalem for his own name's sake. And indeed, in one night, the Assyrian army was struck, and the threat evaporated like mist before the Sunday. Hezekiah bowed in gratitude, the people rejoiced, and Isaiah's voice resounded as proof that trust in God was stronger than the mightiest empire. Yet Isaiah also warned Hezekiah that pride and misplaced trust would one day open the door for Babylon, and the treasures of the palace would be carried away. The words seemed distant then, but they would burn with clarity in later years. The poetry of Isaiah cannot be separated from his prophecy. His words were woven with images that seized the imagination, vineyards yielding only wild grapes as a symbol of Judah's rebellion, the earth trembling under the weight of injustice, the desert blossoming into a garden as a vision of renewal. He painted pictures of judgment where lofty towers fell and proud men bowed low, but also of hope, where nations streamed to the mountain of the Lord, beating swords into plowshares and learning war no more. He envisioned a day when a shoot would spring from the stump of Jesse, when the Spirit of the Lord would rest upon a king who ruled with wisdom, justice, and righteousness. He described a world where the wolf lay with the lamb, the leopard with the goat, the calf with the lion, and a little child leading them. These images lifted the hearts of the faithful even as armies threatened at the gates, for they saw beyond the terror of their present into a future shaped by divine peace. Yet, Isaiah's most mysterious and haunting words were those of the servant songs. He spoke of a servant chosen by God, gentle yet powerful, bringing justice without violence, a light to the nations. He described this servant as despised, rejected, acquainted with grief, pierced for transgressions, crushed for iniquities, yet through his suffering bringing healing and peace. This vision was so profound that it transcended Isaiah's own century, echoing into debates across ages. Jewish interpreters saw in the servant the image of Israel itself, chosen and suffering for the sake of the world. Christians later looked upon Jesus of Nazareth and proclaimed that Isaiah's servant had come in flesh and blood, fulfilling the vision with his crucifixion and resurrection. Whether one views the servant as Israel, as a messianic figure, or as a timeless archetype of redemptive suffering, the power of Isaiah's words remains undeniable. They pierce the human soul, confronting us with the mystery of suffering that brings healing, of weakness that reveals strength, of death that leads to life. Isaiah did not live in ease. Tradition holds that under the reign of King Manasseh, hostile to the prophets, Isaiah was martyred, sawn in two for his testimony. If this tradition is true, his death sealed his role as a prophet whose life, as much as his words, bore witness to the cost of truth. Yet his scroll endured, carried into exile with the people, read aloud in synagogues, copied through generations. His words became the backbone of hope for exiles in Babylon who longed for return and clung to his vision of comfort. "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Every valley shall be lifted up and every mountain and hill made low." The exiles heard these words and found strength to believe that the Lord had not abandoned them. Centuries later, in the wilderness of Judea, another voice cried out, echoing Isaiah's call, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Thus, Isaiah's message leapt across centuries, shaping the identity of a new movement, birthing hope in countless hearts. Isaiah's legacy is vast. He shaped the theology of holiness, justice, and redemption. He redefined the meaning of covenant, not as mere ritual compliance, but as heartfelt devotion to a God who desires justice, mercy, and humility. His vision of God's sovereignty over the nations laid the foundation for understanding history as directed not by empires, but by the hand of the Lord. His prophecies of a coming king, a servant, a redeemer, became the seedbed of messianic hope. His words influenced not only Judaism and Christianity, but also literature, art, and political imagination throughout the centuries. From Handel's Messiah to the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr., Isaiah's voice has continued to resound, calling humanity to higher ground, to a vision where justice and peace embrace. The city of Jerusalem was never far from Isaiah's heart. Its walls stood as both a source of pride and a symbol of fragility. He knew that within those stones lay both the heartbeat of worship and the poison of corruption. He saw the temple as the house of the Holy One, yet he also witnessed the hypocrisy of those who came with offerings while their hands dripped with injustice. His prophetic imagination allowed him to see Jerusalem in two lights: the city as it was, stained with sin, and the city as it would be, radiant with the glory of the Lord. This tension ran like a current through his words, shaping a vision that was both searingly realistic and breathtakingly hopeful. Isaiah understood that to love his people meant to tell them the truth, even when the truth cut deep. And so he spoke relentlessly of judgment, but never without holding out the promise of redemption. In his denunciations of injustice, Isaiah reached beyond mere social critique to the very core of covenantal faith. For him, sin was not simply a list of broken rules. It was the rupture of a relationship with the living God. When rulers oppressed the poor, they were not only committing a political crime, but an act of betrayal against the Lord who demanded justice. When merchants cheated their customers, they were not merely dishonest, but profaning the holiness of God, who called his people to righteousness. Thus, Isaiah's oracles struck with double force. They condemned the corruption of society while revealing that such corruption was ultimately spiritual. To ignore the plight of the orphan, the widow, the stranger was to mock the God who declared himself the defender of the weak. To perform sacrifices while living unjustly was to heap insult upon the very altar of the Lord. In this way, Isaiah shattered the illusion that religion could be separated from ethics, that worship could be divorced from daily life. His voice thundered that the Holy One of Israel demanded integrity of heart as well as ritual of hand. The kings of Judah learned to fear Isaiah's presence, for he carried no regard for royal protocol. He did not flatter or bend his words to please. When King Ahaz trembled at the threats of war, Isaiah stood before him with calm assurance that God's promise to David's line would not fail. When King Hezekiah showed off his treasures to envoys from Babylon, Isaiah sternly warned that those same treasures would one day be carried away into exile. Even in moments of apparent triumph, when Hezekiah prayed and the Assyrian army was struck down, Isaiah did not let the king rest in complacency. He reminded him that pride was always lurking at the door, and that the fate of Judah depended not on military victories but on humility before God. Few prophets in history spoke so directly to kings. Yet Isaiah did so not with arrogance, but with the authority of the vision that burned within him. He was in a sense both counselor and conscience, guiding rulers toward faith while exposing their weaknesses. Isaiah's vision extended beyond Judah to the nations that surrounded it. He saw Assyria as an instrument in God's hand, terrifying yet ultimately subject to divine judgment. He foresaw Babylon rising to power, not merely as a political force, but as a symbol of human pride destined for downfall. He spoke of Egypt's false promises, of Moab's arrogance, of Tyre's wealth. Yet he also envisioned a day when Egypt and Assyria themselves would be blessed alongside Israel, when former enemies would join in worship of the Lord. This international horizon marked Isaiah as unique among prophets. He was not parochial, not merely concerned with his own people's fate. His God was Lord of all nations, and therefore his prophecy encompassed the whole earth. For Isaiah, history was the canvas upon which the sovereignty of God was being painted, stroke by stroke, empire by empire, until all would see and know that the Lord alone is God. The language of Isaiah often soared into poetry that transcended ordinary speech. He compared the pride of humanity to flowers that wither, to grass that fades under the breath of the Lord. He described God as a potter shaping clay, as a shepherd gathering lambs in his arms, as a mother comforting her child. His imagery was both intimate and cosmic, collapsing the distance between the infinite and the personal. This poetic power made his message unforgettable. Even those who resisted his warnings could not forget the rhythm of his words, the images that clung to the mind. The prophet became not only a messenger but a poet laureate of divine truth, whose verses would be sung, remembered, and quoted for centuries. Central to Isaiah's theology was the idea of the Holy One of Israel. This title, used more frequently in Isaiah than anywhere else in Scripture, captured his vision of God as utterly distinct, exalted, and pure. Holiness for Isaiah was not an abstract attribute, but the blazing reality he encountered in the temple vision. It was the weight of glory that made him cry out in despair over his own sin. It was the consuming fire that both judged and purified. To live in covenant with the Holy One was to reflect his character in justice and mercy. To rebel was to invite judgment, not merely as punishment, but as the natural consequence of turning away from the source of life. Thus, Isaiah's message was both terrifying and hopeful. Terrifying because no sin could be hidden from the blazing holiness of God. Hopeful because that same holiness desired to cleanse and restore. As his ministry stretched over decades, Isaiah bore witness to the shifting tides of history. He saw Uzziah's prosperous reign end in leprosy and death. He watched Jotham maintain stability but fail to reform the nation's heart. He confronted Ahaz's fear-driven politics and faithless reliance on Assyria. He supported Hezekiah's reforms and trust in God but warned against pride and short-sighted alliances. Each king revealed a different facet of Judah's struggle to remain faithful in a world dominated by empires. Through it all, Isaiah's message remained consistent. Trust in the Lord, not in human power. Empires rise and fall, kings come and go, but the word of the Lord endures forever. One of Isaiah's most remarkable gifts was his ability to hold judgment and hope together without contradiction. He could pronounce doom upon the city, foretelling that its walls would be torn down and its people carried into exile, and in the same breath describe a remnant returning, rebuilding, and shining with glory. He could envision the earth trembling under divine wrath, and then imagine deserts bursting into bloom with streams of water. This paradoxical vision reflected his profound understanding of God's purposes. Judgment was never the final word. It was the pathway to renewal. Destruction was not the end. It was the prelude to new creation. For Isaiah, God's wrath and God's mercy were two sides of the same coin, both expressions of his passionate commitment to holiness and covenant. The people might despair at his oracles of disaster, but if they listened closely, they would hear the heartbeat of hope pulsing beneath the thunder. As years passed, Isaiah's prophecies were written down, forming a scroll that would be preserved long after his death. That scroll became a companion for exiles in Babylon, a source of comfort and courage. It became a wellspring for sages and teachers, for rabbis and apostles. Its words leapt beyond their original setting to speak anew in every generation. When the early followers of Jesus sought to understand his life and death, they turned to Isaiah's servant songs and found in them a mirror of the crucifixion. When oppressed peoples throughout history searched for assurance that justice would come, they turned to Isaiah's vision of swords beaten into plowshares. When weary souls longed for comfort, they turned to Isaiah's cry, "Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles." Isaiah's voice thus transcended time, becoming not only the prophet of his century but a prophet for the ages. Isaiah's life was not lived in ivory towers but in the turbulent streets of history, where every proclamation met resistance, every vision stirred controversy, and every word carried the weight of eternity. He was a man both revered and reviled, for prophets are rarely welcomed when their messages pierce the heart. In the palace courts, some called him wise counselor. Others whispered that he was a dangerous troublemaker whose predictions unsettled the morale of the people. In the marketplaces, some clung to his promises of deliverance, while others rolled their eyes at his pronouncements of doom. Yet Isaiah never bent his message to win approval, for the fire in his bones was not his own but the word of the Lord. To silence it would have been impossible. Like trying to cage lightning or dam a river with bare hands. He spoke of idols with scorn sharper than swords. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see, ears but cannot hear. Isaiah mocked a craftsman who cut down a tree, used half of it for firewood to warm himself, and from the other half carved a god to worship. Such foolishness, he declared, was the essence of rebellion, exchanging the glory of the Creator for the emptiness of created things. His ridicule was not mere satire, it was a cry of anguish that his people would debase themselves before lifeless objects while ignoring the living God who stretched out the heavens. To Isaiah, idolatry was not only irrational but tragic, for it led the people away from the source of life into the grip of death. But alongside these denunciations came some of the most tender and compassionate words ever spoken. Isaiah proclaimed that though the people were like sheep who had gone astray, the Lord was a shepherd who would gather them close, carrying the lambs in his arms. He spoke of comfort for those in exile, of a day when their warfare would be ended and their iniquity pardoned. He promised strength for the weary, healing for the broken-hearted, freedom for the captives, and beauty for ashes. His words were a balm to the suffering, a light in the darkness, a promise that despair would not have the final word. Even in exile, Isaiah's scroll was unrolled with trembling hands, and exiles wept as they heard him declare that those who sat in darkness would see a great light. Isaiah's influence upon the theology of his people cannot be overstated. He transformed their understanding of God from a local deity to the sovereign of all nations, from a protector of ritual to the Holy One, demanding justice and mercy. His vision of God's transcendence was balanced by an equally profound sense of God's immanence. The Lord not only high and lifted up, enthroned in glory, but also near to the brokenhearted, walking with his people through fire and flood. In this balance, Isaiah laid the foundation for much of later Jewish and Christian theology. His God was not bound by temple walls nor limited to national boundaries. He was the creator of heaven and earth, yet also the Redeemer who stooped to save. The servant songs scattered through the latter chapters of Isaiah's scroll remain among the most enigmatic and powerful passages in all of Scripture. They describe a figure both exalted and despised, a servant chosen by God to bring justice, not by crushing force, but by quiet endurance. He does not cry out or lift up his voice, yet he establishes justice across the earth. He is a covenant for the people, a light to the nations, opening blind eyes, freeing prisoners from darkness. And yet this servant is also marred beyond human likeness, despised and rejected, acquainted with grief. He bears the sins of many, is pierced for their transgressions, crushed for their iniquities. Through his wounds comes healing, through his suffering comes peace. The paradox is almost unbearable. Triumph through humiliation, victory through apparent defeat. Generations have wrestled with the identity of this servant. Is it Israel as a nation suffering on behalf of the world? Is it a messianic figure, the anointed one who embodies Israel's destiny? Is it perhaps both a symbol and a person, a vision that finds fulfillment across layers of history? Whatever the answer, Isaiah's servant has captured the imagination of countless souls, standing as one of the most haunting and hope-filled portraits of redemptive suffering ever conceived. Isaiah also envisioned a new creation, a renewal of the cosmos itself. He spoke of a time when the former things would not be remembered, when joy and gladness would fill the earth, when the wolf and the lamb would feed together and the lion eat straw like the ox. He described a new heavens and a new earth where death and sorrow would be no more. This eschatological vision stretched beyond the immediate concerns of Judah into the ultimate destiny of humanity. It suggested that God's purposes were not limited to political survival or national restoration, but encompassed the transformation of the entire world. For Isaiah, history was moving toward a horizon of unimaginable glory, where the Holy One would dwell with his people in everlasting peace. The prophet's own life, however, was far from peaceful. According to tradition preserved in later writings, Isaiah met a violent end during the reign of Manasseh, a king who rejected the reforms of his father Hezekiah and plunged Judah into idolatry and bloodshed. Isaiah's uncompromising voice could not be tolerated, and he was sawn in two, martyred for the truth he proclaimed. Whether this tradition is historically precise or not, it reflects the deep conviction that Isaiah's life ended in faithfulness unto death. His blood, like his words, testified that the calling of a prophet was never safe but always costly. He had stood against kings, against nations, against the tide of history itself, armed with nothing but the word of the Lord, and in the end, he paid the price. Yet, even in death, his voice was not silenced. His scroll remained, and through it, his spirit lived on. Centuries later, when the scroll of Isaiah was opened in a synagogue in Nazareth, a carpenter's son read the words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll and declared, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." With those words, the prophecy of Isaiah leapt into new life, claimed by one who saw himself as the servant, the redeemer, the embodiment of Isaiah's vision. Whether one accepts this claim or not, it demonstrates the enduring power of Isaiah's words to shape identity, mission, and hope. His prophecies were not locked in the past. They were living words, still unfolding, still pressing upon the conscience of humanity. The enduring legacy of Isaiah lies in this fusion of judgment and hope, holiness and compassion, present crisis and future glory. His voice calls across the centuries to every generation facing injustice, idolatry, fear, or despair. He reminds us that God is not mocked, that human pride will fall, that the way of false trust leads to ruin. But he also assures us that no darkness is too deep for God's light, no exile too long for God's comfort, no sin too great for God's redemption. Isaiah's vision is vast, cosmic, embracing all nations and all of history. Yet it is also intimate, speaking to the individual heart that trembles in fear or weeps in sorrow. His scroll holds within it both the thunder of divine majesty and the whisper of divine tenderness. And so as the centuries have rolled on, Isaiah's words have continued to inspire revolutions of spirit and awakenings of conscience. They have been sung in cathedrals and whispered in prison cells, inscribed in works of art and shouted in marches for justice. They have comforted the dying and emboldened the oppressed. They have been debated in seminaries and cherished in households. Few voices in history have traveled so far, so long, with such enduring resonance. Isaiah's fire still burns, his vision still shines, his poetry still sings, and though his earthly life ended long ago, his words remain immortal, for they carry within them the breath of the eternal. The memory of Isaiah lingered like a flame that could not be extinguished. Long after his voice had fallen silent, the scroll that bore his words traveled across generations, read aloud in synagogues, copied by scribes, pondered by exiles, and recited by those who longed for hope. To read Isaiah was never simply to encounter history, it was to enter into a vision where heaven and earth collided, where the Holy One walked among mortals, and where judgment and mercy embraced in mysterious harmony. The exile in Babylon made Isaiah's words more relevant than ever. His declaration of comfort, "Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain made low," resonated with the people who had lost their homeland, their temple, their identity. His vision of return, of streams in the desert and a highway for the redeemed, offered not only hope for survival, but assurance of restoration. The captives by the rivers of Babylon found in Isaiah's poetry a reason to lift their heads, a reminder that their story was not finished, that their God had not abandoned them. The universal scope of Isaiah's prophecy also became increasingly clear in exile. He spoke not only of Israel's return, but of nations streaming to Jerusalem to learn the ways of the Lord. He imagined Egypt and Assyria, once bitter enemies, joining Israel in worship, bound together in blessing. This vision defied political logic, for no one could conceive of such reconciliation between empires drenched in blood. Yet Isaiah insisted that the future belonged not to perpetual conflict but to divine peace. His dream was of a world reordered by God's justice, where enmity dissolved into fellowship, where diversity became unity without erasing identity. This international vision elevated Isaiah above the politics of his day and placed him in the realm of prophetic imagination that continues to inspire movements for peace across centuries. Isaiah's words also shaped the theology of suffering. His servant songs provided a framework for understanding how suffering could be redemptive rather than meaningless. The servant was crushed, despised, and afflicted, yet his suffering became the channel through which healing and justice would flow. For Israel in exile, this imagery resonated deeply. Their national humiliation could be reinterpreted as part of a divine purpose, their pain as not wasted but woven into a larger plan. Later, Christians would see in this figure the foreshadowing of Jesus Christ, whose suffering on the cross was understood as fulfillment of Isaiah's vision. The universality of this theme has allowed Isaiah's servant to speak across cultures and contexts, offering a way to see dignity and hope even in the midst of oppression. Back in Jerusalem, when the exiles finally returned, Isaiah's vision served as both inspiration and challenge. The city lay in ruins, the temple in ashes, and the people faced the daunting task of rebuilding. It would have been easy to sink into despair, yet Isaiah's promise of a new heavens and a new earth lifted their eyes beyond rubble to glory. He reminded them that restoration was not only physical but spiritual. Justice had to replace corruption, humility had to replace pride, true worship had to replace empty ritual. Without this transformation, mere rebuilding of walls would not suffice. Thus, Isaiah's voice continued to guide, even though he was long dead, shaping the moral and spiritual framework of a reborn community. The beauty of Isaiah's poetry cannot be separated from its theological depth. His metaphors drew from the rhythms of creation, the rising of the sun, the blooming of flowers, the flowing of rivers. He used the language of nature to describe divine action, the mountains rejoicing, the trees clapping their hands, the wilderness singing for joy. By weaving creation into his prophecy, Isaiah declared that redemption was not limited to humanity but embraced the entire cosmos. His vision anticipated a renewal of all things, where harmony would extend from human relationships to the animal kingdom, from political structures to the natural world itself. The wolf dwelling with the lamb was not mere fantasy. It was the embodiment of peace that touched every corner of existence. Isaiah's influence spread far beyond his own tradition. His scroll became one of the most quoted in later writings. The New Testament drew heavily from his imagery, presenting him as the prophet whose words illuminated the mission of Jesus. Early Christians found in Isaiah's servant songs a key to understanding the crucifixion, and in his visions of light to the nations, a mandate for spreading their message beyond Israel. Yet even outside Christianity, Isaiah's themes of justice, peace, and divine holiness resonated. His declaration that true worship is caring for the oppressed has inspired reformers and revolutionaries. His dream of swords turned into plowshares has been inscribed on monuments, invoked in speeches, and held as a banner for movements seeking peace. Few figures in history have had their words travel so widely, entering not only religious traditions but also the vocabulary of human rights and social justice. But to truly understand Isaiah is not only to analyze his words but to feel the passion that drove him. He was a man seized by vision, compelled to speak even when it cost him everything. He knew rejection, for prophets are rarely honored in their own time. He knew danger, for kings and rulers do not easily tolerate voices that challenge their power. He knew loneliness, for the path of truth is often solitary. Yet he also knew joy, for he had glimpsed the glory of God. And once a man has seen that vision, no suffering can extinguish the flame of hope. Isaiah's life was a paradox of burden and blessing, of anguish and ecstasy, of despair over sin and ecstasy in the presence of the holy. His theology of the remnant was another lasting contribution. He insisted that though judgment would sweep across the land, a remnant would remain, a purified group who would carry the covenant forward. This idea gave hope that even in the darkest times, God's promises would not fail. The concept of a faithful remnant became central in later Jewish and Christian thought, offering assurance that no matter how widespread corruption or disaster, God always preserves a people for himself. The remnant was not defined by power or numbers, but by faithfulness, by the willingness to trust in the Holy One. This theology prevented despair and sustained hope across centuries of persecution and trial. Isaiah's legacy also lies in his portrayal of God as both judge and redeemer. He did not shrink from proclaiming divine wrath against sin, yet he equally proclaimed divine mercy that longs to save. The same God who brings down the proud also lifts up the lowly. The same holiness that exposes sin also purifies the sinner. This dual vision prevents caricatures of God as either harsh tyrant or indulgent grandfather. Instead, Isaiah presents a God of burning holiness and tender compassion, whose justice and mercy are perfectly intertwined. This vision continues to challenge and inspire theology, for it refuses to simplify the divine into human categories. In his closing visions, Isaiah painted a picture of ultimate restoration that transcends the boundaries of time. A new heavens and a new earth, joy without sorrow, peace without end. Nations streaming to the light of the Lord, the glory of God filling the earth as waters cover the sea. This eschatological hope lifts the imagination beyond immediate struggles into a future where the purposes of God are fully realized. For Isaiah, this was not escapism, but the ultimate grounding of faith, to live in the present with eyes fixed on the horizon of eternity. Such vision gave courage to exiles, strength to martyrs, and endurance to all who walk through valleys of despair. Thus, Isaiah stands not merely as a prophet of the 8th century before Christ, but as a timeless voice whose words continue to reverberate. He is a poet of holiness, a seer of justice, a herald of redemption. His vision encompasses judgment and mercy, history and eternity, Israel and the nations, the individual heart, and the cosmos itself. To read Isaiah is to be confronted with the blazing holiness of God and the boundless depths of divine compassion. His words do not allow neutrality, they demand response. Either one humbles oneself before the Holy One, or resists and faces judgment. Either one clings to idols or trusts in the living God. Either one despairs in exile or lifts one's eyes to the vision of return. In every age, Isaiah's call resounds, "Trust in the Lord, for in him is everlasting strength." The story of Isaiah's vision is not confined to parchment and ink. It is a drama that continues to echo in the human soul. Every generation that encounters his scroll faces the same piercing questions. Whom do you trust when empires threaten? What is true worship when rituals are abundant, but hearts are cold? Where do you turn when injustice seems to triumph and the weak are crushed? Isaiah forces his hearers to wrestle with these realities, for his words are never abstract theology alone. They are living summonses to decision. The kings of Judah learned this in their own flesh, as alliances with foreign powers failed and idolatry eroded their strength. The exiles in Babylon learnt it as they discovered that even in a foreign land, God's word remained alive. And we who read today learn it anew, that Isaiah's God is not bound by history but continues to speak, confronting the pride of nations and the despair of individuals alike. The prophet's imagery of light and darkness became one of his most enduring legacies. To those walking in despair, he declared that a great light would dawn. To the arrogant who trusted in their own strength, he promised that darkness would swallow their pride. Light for Isaiah was never merely physical. It was the manifestation of God's presence, the illumination of truth, the warmth of hope. Darkness was never only the absence of sun, but the symbol of idolatry, oppression, and estrangement from God. These metaphors became so powerful that later writers, poets, and preachers adopted them as shorthand for the human condition. Isaiah's voice taught generations to long for light, to see salvation as illumination, and to recognize evil as darkness. Such imagery transcends language barriers, resonating in every culture, for all people know the fear of night and the relief of dawn. The prophet also gave profound attention to the role of memory. Again and again, he called the people to remember the covenant, to recall the deeds of God in the past, to not forget the holy law that bound them to their Creator. Forgetfulness was for Isaiah not merely a lapse of mind, but an act of rebellion. To forget God's deliverance from Egypt, to forget His provision in the wilderness, was to betray the very identity of Israel. Memory, therefore, was a sacred act, a way of keeping covenant alive. His words remind us that faith is not only about the future we hope for, but the past we remember. In Isaiah's poetry, the people are urged to look back so that they may move forward to recall God's faithfulness in order to trust Him anew. In this, the prophet links memory and hope, weaving the fabric of identity across generations. Isaiah's confrontation with idolatry also continues to resonate with startling relevance. While few in modern times carve wooden statues to bow before, the essence of idolatry remains unchanged, placing ultimate trust in what is not God. Wealth, power, ideology, technology, these too can become idols, demanding loyalty, shaping identity, and deceiving hearts. Isaiah's scorn for idols carved from the same wood used for firewood unmasks the absurdity of false trust in every age. His call to worship the living God rather than the works of human hands remains a warning for societies intoxicated with their own achievements. The prophet insists that only the Creator can sustain creation, only the Holy One can satisfy the heart. Everything else, however glittering, is dust before the breath of God. The prophet's endurance across decades also provides a model of faithfulness. Unlike figures who appear briefly in history and vanish, Isaiah sustained his mission through the reigns of multiple kings, each with different challenges. His courage was not a momentary outburst but a lifelong vocation. This endurance required deep roots in the vision of God's holiness. Without such a foundation, he could never have withstood the ridicule, opposition, and danger that confronted him. His persistence teaches that prophetic witness is not about sudden inspiration alone, but about daily fidelity, year after year, regardless of results. He may not have seen immediate change in his society, but his words endured, shaping generations beyond his own. True influence, Isaiah's life suggests, is measured not in instant success, but in lasting faithfulness to truth. In the scroll that bears his name, one hears not only the voice of judgment, but also the tenderness of comfort. Isaiah was not content to denounce sin. He also proclaimed healing. "Comfort, comfort my people," he cried, announcing forgiveness and restoration. This pastoral dimension shows that prophecy is not only about exposing corruption, but about binding wounds. His assurance that those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength, mounting up with wings like eagles, has become one of the most beloved promises in Scripture. Such words have carried countless weary souls through trials, reminding them that God's strength is not depleted, that renewal is possible even in the darkest times. Isaiah thus embodies the balance of prophet and pastor, truth teller and comfort giver, thunder and whisper. The remnant theology Isaiah developed holds significance not only for his time but for all communities facing crisis. To know that even when disaster strikes, God preserves a faithful few, provides resilience. It teaches that numbers do not define truth, that even a small group holding fast to righteousness can carry forward the covenant. This concept has empowered minority communities throughout history, reminding them that faithfulness, not majority, is what matters. It has given courage to persecuted groups, sustaining them with the assurance that God's purposes do not depend on the approval of the powerful, but on the persistence of the faithful. Isaiah's remnant theology thus serves as a shield against despair, a call to persevere when all seems lost. Another striking element of Isaiah's vision is his insistence on the transformation of the heart. Sacrifices and rituals, however elaborate, are worthless if the heart is corrupt. This principle dismantled any illusion that external conformity could replace inner devotion. Isaiah's critique of empty religion paved the way for a deeper spirituality, one rooted in sincerity, justice, and humility. His words remind us that true worship is not measured by outward display but by the alignment of life with God's will. Such teaching continues to challenge religious communities to examine whether their practices reflect genuine devotion or hollow performance. Isaiah, standing in the temple filled with smoke, reminds us that the God who dwells in glory demands hearts that are pure, lives that embody justice, and love that reflects His holiness. The literary artistry of Isaiah's scroll also explains its enduring power. His use of parallelism, rhythm, and imagery gives his prophecy a beauty that transcends translation. Even when rendered in other languages, the force of his poetry remains. This artistry demonstrates that truth can be communicated not only through argument, but through beauty. Isaiah's words delight the ear even as they convict the heart, proving that poetry and prophecy are not rivals but allies. His genius as a poet ensures that his message is not only remembered, but cherished, not only studied, but sung. The prophet understood that beauty itself could bear witness to the Creator, and he wove beauty into his message as an offering of praise. Isaiah's eschatological hope has influenced countless visions of the future. His dream of a peaceable kingdom where predators and prey live in harmony has been painted in art, sung in hymns, and preached in sermons. His vision of nations streaming to the mountain of the Lord, beating swords into plowshares, has inspired peace movements and international organizations. His prophecy of a new heavens and a new earth has shaped theological understandings of ultimate destiny. By expanding hope beyond immediate restoration to cosmic renewal, Isaiah lifted human imagination to its highest horizon. He refused to let despair have the last word, insisting instead that God's purposes aim at a future of joy, peace, and everlasting light. Thus, Isaiah's scroll is not merely an ancient artifact, but a living fountain. It continues to pour forth wisdom, challenge, and hope. Its words reach across boundaries of time and culture, speaking as freshly today as when they were first uttered. To engage Isaiah is to be confronted with holiness, to be invited into trust, to be challenged toward justice, to be comforted in despair, and to be lifted into hope. The prophet's legacy endures because his words are not his own, but bear the breath of the eternal, the vision of the Almighty, the heartbeat of divine compassion. Isaiah's vision did not end with his generation. It became a living thread, woven through centuries of human longing. The exiles who sat weeping by the rivers of Babylon clung to his words like lifelines, repeating them in hushed voices as they dreamed of Jerusalem restored. They remembered his promise that those who sowed in tears would reap with shouts of joy, that those who waited upon the Lord would rise on wings like eagles. His poetry gave them permission to hope again when their eyes saw only ruins. The return from exile was not easy, and many were disillusioned by the harsh realities of rebuilding a city reduced to rubble. Yet Isaiah's scroll kept their vision alive, reminding them that God's promise was not measured by immediate circumstances, but by His eternal faithfulness. The prophets who followed drew heavily from Isaiah's themes. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah all echoed the tension of judgment and hope, the call to return to the Lord, the vision of restoration that would embrace not only Israel but the nations, but none reached the poetic heights or cosmic scope of Isaiah. He stood alone as the prophet whose imagination soared beyond the boundaries of time, anticipating not only national restoration but the renewal of creation itself. For this reason, Isaiah became the prophet most quoted in later writings, the one whose voice was heard most clearly in moments of both despair and revival. His vision became the backbone of eschatological hope, the framework within which later generations interpreted their struggles and longings. Isaiah's words also found a home in liturgy. They were recited in the synagogue, shaping the prayers of generations. His cry of "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts" became the foundation of worship, echoed in heavenly visions recorded centuries later. His proclamation of comfort, his promises of redemption, his visions of peace, all became part of the spiritual rhythm of Israel. Worshippers heard Isaiah not as distant history, but as present voice, as though the prophet himself still stood among them. This liturgical role ensured that Isaiah's words were not forgotten, but kept alive in the daily and weekly life of the community. The scroll was not simply studied, it was sung, prayed, proclaimed, lived. In later centuries, Isaiah's vision of a servant who suffers and redeems became a stumbling block and a cornerstone. Many could not reconcile the image of a suffering servant with their expectations of power and victory. Yet for those who saw in suffering the hidden work of God, Isaiah's servant offered profound insight. The paradox of triumph through humiliation, healing through wounds, life through death defied human logic but revealed divine mystery. This vision allowed later communities to reinterpret their own suffering not as meaningless but as potentially redemptive. Whether applied to Israel as a nation, to a messianic figure, or to the faithful remnant, the servant songs offered a lens through which pain could be endured with hope. Isaiah thus became not only a prophet of judgment and restoration, but also a theologian of suffering, providing resources for faith in times of deepest trial. The impact of Isaiah extended even into political imagination. His declaration that rulers must govern with justice, that nations must not oppress the weak, that true strength lies in righteousness, shaped ideals of leadership. His vision of peace, where swords are beaten into plowshares, inspired countless movements that sought to replace violence with reconciliation. In times of war, Isaiah's words were banners for peace. In times of oppression, his words were weapons of truth. From ancient rabbis to modern reformers, Isaiah's insistence that justice and righteousness are the foundation of society has resonated as both critique and aspiration. His poetry continues to challenge rulers and peoples alike to align their policies and lives with the demands of holiness. Isaiah's description of God as both transcendent and immanent remains one of his most profound contributions. He saw the Lord high and lifted up, his robe filling the temple, seraphim crying, "Holy, holy, holy." Yet he also spoke of God as a shepherd carrying lambs, as a mother comforting her child, as a redeemer who walks with his people through fire and water. This balance of majesty and intimacy prevents extremes. God is neither distant and cold, nor indulgent and trivial. He is both awesome in glory and tender in compassion. This vision has shaped theology across centuries, offering a God who is worthy of worship yet approachable in love. Isaiah's God is the God of the cosmos and the God of the heart, the one who rules empires and wipes tears from eyes. His insistence on ethical religion also remains timeless. Isaiah condemned sacrifices offered without justice, prayers lifted without mercy, fasting done without compassion. He declared that the true fast is to loose the bonds of wickedness, to share bread with the hungry, to clothe the naked, to shelter the homeless. These words continue to pierce religious hypocrisy in every age, reminding us that rituals without righteousness are empty. Isaiah's call is for integrated faith, where worship and justice, prayer and compassion, devotion and ethics are inseparably joined. This holistic vision challenges communities to examine whether their piety aligns with their treatment of others. Isaiah's voice still cries out, "Cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." The prophet's visions of cosmic renewal push human imagination to its limits. He saw a world where creation itself rejoices, where deserts bloom, where animals live in harmony, where death and sorrow are no more. This eschatological horizon has fueled hope for a better world, reminding us that history is not a closed circle of despair, but a journey toward redemption. Isaiah's poetry lifts our eyes beyond the immediate and the temporary, grounding endurance in the certainty of ultimate joy. His vision is not mere utopia, but divine promise, anchored in the faithfulness of the Creator. For those who suffer, Isaiah offers not only comfort in the present, but assurance of glory to come. His words stretch hope beyond generations, carrying humanity toward the dawn of eternal peace. Tradition holds that Isaiah's life ended in martyrdom, sawn in two under King Manasseh. Whether literal or symbolic, this tradition captures the cost of his faithfulness. Prophets do not die in comfort. They die under the weight of truth rejected. Yet Isaiah's death, like his life, was not in vain. His words lived on, outlasting kings and empires, speaking into contexts he never saw, shaping movements he could never have imagined. His martyrdom sealed his witness, testifying that truth is worth more than life, that fidelity to the Holy One is greater than survival. In this, Isaiah joined the line of prophets and martyrs whose blood became the seed of hope. His legacy was not extinguished by death but magnified, for the scroll that bore his words could not be silenced. And so across the centuries, Isaiah continues to walk among us, not in flesh, but in word. His poetry still calls nations to justice, still comforts the brokenhearted, still promises redemption. His vision still challenges idolatries, still unveils the Holy One, still points toward the new heavens and new earth. To read Isaiah is to step into the fire of holiness and the embrace of compassion, to be judged and comforted, wounded and healed. His scroll remains one of humanity's greatest treasures, a beacon of divine vision that refuses to fade. As long as injustice remains, Isaiah's thunder will resound. As long as despair lingers, Isaiah's comfort will whisper. As long as hope endures, Isaiah's vision will shine. The vision of Isaiah endures not because it was tied to a single moment in history, but because it speaks to the condition of humanity in every age. His voice still rings out wherever nations tremble before empires, wherever people struggle with injustice, wherever hearts yearn for hope. He speaks to kings who rely on power instead of righteousness, to societies that worship wealth instead of justice, to individuals who bow before idols of their own making. And he speaks equally to the brokenhearted, to the exiled, to those who believe they have been forgotten. His poetry is a sword and a balm, cutting through pride while healing despair. Few voices in history have carried such paradoxical power, and perhaps that is why Isaiah remains unforgettable. The weight of Isaiah's calling can only be understood in the light of his temple vision. That encounter with the Holy One defined everything that followed. When he saw the Lord high and lifted up, when he felt the burning coal touch his lips, he was marked forever. That vision was not a passing experience, but the anchor of his soul, the fire that sustained him through decades of opposition. He knew what he had seen, and no mockery, no threat, no suffering could erase it. The prophet's endurance sprang from that holy encounter. It is a reminder to all who seek to live faithfully that vision is necessary for endurance, that without a glimpse of glory, one cannot carry the weight of truth. Isaiah's story begins and ends with the holiness of God. A holiness that judges and purifies, terrifies and comforts, destroys and renews. The holiness Isaiah proclaimed was not abstract but relational. It demanded that the people embody justice, mercy and humility. It insisted that the orphan and widow be cared for, that oppression be undone, that honesty and integrity prevail. This holiness was not satisfied with ritual performance. It required transformation of life. In this way, Isaiah revealed that God's holiness is not only a matter of divine otherness, but of human reflection. The people were called to be holy as the Lord is holy, to mirror his character in their society. Isaiah's fierce denunciations of corruption, greed, and injustice flowed from this vision. He was not simply moralizing. He was proclaiming that to betray justice was to betray God himself. Holiness was the measure not only of worship, but of politics, economics, and relationships. Such a vision remains as radical today as it was in ancient Judah, confronting societies that separate faith from ethics, religion from justice. The hope Isaiah offered was equally profound. He did not minimize the reality of judgment, but he insisted that judgment was not the end. A remnant would survive, purified and renewed. A child would be born, bearing titles of wonder, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. A shoot would spring from the stump of Jesse, a king filled with the Spirit of the Lord, ruling with righteousness and bringing peace. A servant would suffer and redeem, despised yet exalted, broken yet victorious. A Redeemer would come to Zion, turning transgression into forgiveness. and ultimately a new heavens and a new earth would shine with everlasting joy. These promises transcended the crises of Isaiah's day, reaching into horizons that even he may not have fully understood. They became the foundation of messianic hope, the wellspring of eschatological vision, the anchor of faith in times of despair. The universality of Isaiah's vision is one of its greatest marvels. He was deeply rooted in the life of Judah, yet his words stretched to encompass all nations and all creation. He saw Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt not as mere political players but as actors in the drama of God's sovereignty. He envisioned their downfall but also their redemption, their judgment but also their inclusion in blessing. He saw creation itself caught up in redemption, deserts blossoming, mountains singing, trees clapping their hands. His prophecy refuses to be confined to parochial concerns. It points to a God who is Lord of history and Lord of the cosmos, whose purposes embrace every nation, every people, every corner of creation. This universality has ensured that Isaiah's words never grow old, for they speak beyond boundaries, inviting all humanity into the vision of holiness and hope. The suffering servant remains Isaiah's most haunting gift. His description of one who is despised and rejected, pierced and crushed, bearing the sins of many, has echoed through centuries of interpretation. For Jews, it has symbolized the suffering of Israel itself, carrying the weight of history. For Christians, it has pointed to Jesus Christ, whose crucifixion fulfilled the paradox of triumph through suffering. For others, it has served as an archetype of redemptive suffering, a vision that gives meaning to pain endured for the sake of others. This figure stands at the heart of Isaiah's mystery, a paradox that defies easy resolution. Yet in that mystery lies the power of his vision, that God's purposes are revealed not only in strength but in weakness, not only in glory but in humility, not only in life but through death. The servant embodies the scandalous truth that redemption comes through suffering, a truth that continues to confound and inspire. Isaiah's end, according to tradition, came through martyrdom. His death under Manasseh's reign symbolizes the rejection prophets often face, yet it also seals his witness. He lived and died as one who spoke truth at any cost. His blood, like his words, bore testimony to the holiness of God and the call to faithfulness. Martyrdom is the prophet's crown, and Isaiah wore it with dignity. His life was a seed sown in suffering, yet the harvest of his vision has nourished countless generations. His death reminds us that truth is rarely comfortable, that fidelity to God may cost everything, yet that such fidelity is never wasted. For though Isaiah's body was destroyed, his words could not be silenced. They live on, carrying the power of the vision he beheld in the temple, the holiness that filled his soul, the fire that burned in his bones. The enduring influence of Isaiah is seen in how often his words are invoked. From synagogues to churches, from cathedrals to humble gatherings, his poetry is read and sung. Reformers quote him to challenge injustice, artists paint his visions of peace, composers set his promises to music, leaders echo his cries for righteousness. His prophecy has inspired revolutions of spirit and society alike. The abolition of slavery, the fight for civil rights, the pursuit of peace all have drawn upon Isaiah's vision. When Martin Luther King Jr. declared, "Every valley shall be exalted and every hill made low," he was echoing Isaiah, giving voice to a dream rooted in prophetic vision. Isaiah's words are thus not relics of the past, but weapons of hope for the present, still shaping movements, still igniting courage. The prophet's scroll ends with a vision of new creation, a cosmos remade in joy and peace. This is not a return to Eden, but the culmination of history, the fulfillment of God's purposes. In that vision, sorrow is swallowed by joy, death is overcome by life, violence is replaced by peace. The holy city shines with glory, nations gather in worship, and creation itself rejoices. Isaiah's final word is not judgment but restoration, not despair but hope, not exile but homecoming. This eschatological vision lifts the eyes beyond every present struggle, anchoring faith in the certainty of ultimate redemption. It assures us that no darkness, however deep, can extinguish the light of God's promise. And so, Isaiah's story concludes not in silence but in song. His life was marked by vision and burden, by rejection and hope, by suffering and faithfulness. His words have become immortal, shaping theology, worship, art, and justice across millennia. He remains the prophet of holiness and hope, the poet of judgment and redemption, the herald of a new creation. To read Isaiah is to step into the fire of God's holiness and the embrace of His mercy, to be confronted with sin and comforted with grace, to be judged and redeemed. His voice calls across the centuries, "Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord God is an everlasting rock." And his vision continues to shine, a beacon for all who long for justice, peace, and the glory of the Holy One. Thus ends the tale of Isaiah, not ended, for his words still live, but fulfilled in the sense that his vision has carried us from the courts of Jerusalem to the horizons of eternity. His scroll remains open, his poetry still sings, his prophecy still burns. And as long as humanity longs for light in darkness, Isaiah's voice will resound, declaring that the Holy One is faithful, that redemption is near, that hope is eternal.